Welcome, champions, to the next overview and tier list ranking featuring the newest champion. However, we've got a lot more than just that this time around, because Events 2.0 has landed, which means not only am I going to talk about the new champion and what Events 2.0 brings to the table, but there's also a reworked champion to cover as well. If you're only here for something in particular, always remember the timestamps in the description. So let's just jump right on into what Events 2.0 means as the new standard of events. To start, events will run for 3 weeks instead of 2, generally starting on the first Wednesday of every month. So, 1 event per month, predictably starting near the beginning of the month. Because of this, we have less overall events, 12 down from 17. And as events are generally seasonal in theme, that means instead of a persistent cycle of that 17, 5 of them are being phased out, and the champions tied to those will be dispersed among the standard 12. Eventually, Midwinter, Greengrass, The Running, Midsummer, and Bright Swords will be retired. Though that being said, we are going to see one last Greengrass in April. Now, as for what champions you have to work with during an event, there are no longer 3 champions available to run their adventures and variants. Instead, we have slots to work with. 2 of these slots are set, featuring 2 champions being highlighted in the event. These will generally be 1 new champion and 1 reworked champion. This event, Festival of Fools, features the Dark Urge as the newcomer and Dhadius as the rework. On top of the featured set champion slots, there are flex slots, where you will be able to choose from a pool of available champions tied to the currently running event. This event, Festival of Fools, we have these to choose from. So as you can see, we can choose from even retired champions. 1 of the flex slots will be available at the start of the event. The second unlocks on week 2, and the third will be available for the third and final week. Everyone will have access to the 2 set champions and these 3 flex slots. However, a 4th flex slot, referred to as the supporter slot, can be unlocked if you make an in-game purchase of specially marked event-related DLC during the event. For the record, in my personal opinion, I'd recommend slotting Briv in that first flex slot for this event, to get those jumps going, baby. As for who to use in the second and third flex slots, my personal recommendations would be between Miria, Tatiana, and Alindra, depending on what you need in your formations. Now, this wasn't revealed until the evening before Events 2.0 dropped, but the flex slots available 2 weeks in and 3 weeks in, the second and third flex slots, will each require 3 time gate pieces to unlock. This really should have been highlighted before that, but that could have been an honest mistake. That being said, I think this is, in general, just a straight up mistake. Sure, people who have been actively playing this game will be able to afford 6 time gate pieces a month to invest in this, but new players are completely hamstrung by it. New players already have the limitation of only being able to push so hard in the tiers to begin with, and they are the ones who will need to be unlocking champions more frequently, especially now that events are happening less frequently and they have less opportunities to unlock champions. I really do hope this gets looked into in the future. Also, I was worried about them monetizing Events 2.0, and I'm not thrilled by this, but having 5 champion slots to work with every event I think is fair. And 5 champions every 12 events will be 60 available champions to gear up during events every year, as opposed to the previous 3 champions every 17 events, equaling 51. And we have greater freedom in choosing who we want to focus on. I think overall it's a fair trade in terms of gearing up. The concern then becomes the fact there are simply far less new champions and reworked champions overall. Hopefully this new structure will offer them the time required for other aspects of the game. But what does gearing up champions during an event look like now? First of all, it's important to note that the reworked champions will have dismantling enabled for the event. However, if you purchase any chest for them during the event, that will disable the option to dismantle. So you can't just feed yourself item levels. So be sure if you plan to dismantle the reworked champion, you do not purchase any chests for them beforehand. Getting chests for event champions works a bit different now, however. You no longer farm free plays up to 50 to be rewarded a chest upon completion. You instead buy chests directly with event tokens. This will be the only use of event tokens from now on, because all of the adventures and free plays for event champions will no longer require you to pay to attempt them. Also, tokens are a bit easier to work with, because now bounty contracts used outside of events will award event tokens for the next upcoming event, and any remaining tokens, when the event ends, will be automatically used to purchase chests for your slotted event champions randomly should you forget to spend them. So what about adventures and variants then? Well, they've been expanded upon. While they don't cost event tokens to attempt, they have scaling tiers of difficulty and rewards upon completion, such as gold chests for that champion, feats, and buffs active during the event. Tier 1 has the standard of Variant 1 at Area 75, Variant 2 at 125, and Variant 3 at 175. But when you complete all three, you will unlock Tier 2. Then you can run them again, but completion is more difficult, as the areas become 250, 350, and 450 respectively, which in turn unlocks Tier 3 at 600, 800, and 1000, and that will finally unlock Tier 4 at the much more difficult 1200, 1400, and 1600. Depending on your progression within the game, you will very much not be able to finish some of these variants, especially considering the restrictions of many of them. But worry not, the game will remember your progress if you have to come back and attempt them next year. Now then, let's get to the meat and potatoes of this event, starting with the Dark Urge, who I will be referring to as Dirge for the rest of the video. The chaotic evil dragonborn sorcerer in Seed 11, the next member of the Absolute Adversaries and their dedicated DPS. This is a bit of an interesting choice to me, as Dirge is a representation of the player's freedom in Baldur's Gate 3, being the only base character or origin that you can freely edit the starting race, class, and gender to suit your personal role-playing tastes, while also offering you a compelling personalized story as opposed to the set characters like we've seen previously. Though this is the standard beginning template of that character, who I also think is a pretty dope-looking Dragonborn if I'm being honest. His basic attack will have him move up to the closest enemy and attack all nearby enemies with the slash of his dagger. His ultimate ability is tied to the second set of his specialization choices, so we'll get to that when I cover those. So let's dip into his formation abilities, starting with Dark Inheritance, where he becomes available for all adventures regardless of patrons, variants, or other restrictions. That's right, everything, like Dungeon Master. I'm a dirty little availability slut. However, with this he also does not interact with any champion abilities or variant effects that are based on age. So speaking of DM, he would not qualify for Patience, young ones. He has multiple ways to scale his own damage, being exclusively a DPS, starting with the Urge, where each time he kills an enemy, he gains a murder stack. He will increase his damage for each murder stack, and these persist through runs. As you might expect, that means it's only a very small damage boost and only an additive stack, but still, increased damage nonetheless. These murder stacks can eventually cap out at 4E9, or 4 billion. Second, being from the Absolute Adversaries, he of course carries that worm in the brain, gaining Ceramorphosis and contributing 1 Ceramorphosis to the formation. In his case, this will directly increase his damage for each Ceramorphosis stack in your formation, stacking multiplicatively and scaling with the pre-stack, so this will become a very potent self-DPS buff. Third, he has Living on the Edge, which naturally has 6 stacks, but will be reduced by 1 for each champion adjacent to him that does not have the DPS role. His damage will similarly multiplicatively be increased for each of these stacks, and yes, this also scales with its pre-stack. That means he's a DPS working with 2 different pre-stack multipliers. Quite nice indeed. He has 2 sets of specializations, the first of the choices being represented by his sorceress origins. Storm Sorcery will empower his basic attack with lightning, increasing its range by 200%, and dealing up to 800% more damage to enemies based on how close they are to him. Draconic Bloodline will increase his damage by 200% for each Dragonborn champion in the formation, stacking multiplicatively, and Divine Soul, which will increase the number of murder stacks he gains each time he kills an enemy by 200%, meaning it will count for 3. The second set of choices will determine his ultimate attack, and scale his damage in different ways. Embrace the Urge will cause Dirge to deal more damage for each evil champion in the formation, stacking multiplicatively, and unlock the Form of the Slayer ultimate, which will cause him to move to the enemy's side of the screen and transform for 15 seconds. During this time, Scalaritus Fell will take his spot in the formation, while Dirge gains a new melee attack and deals ultimate damage, while being immune to damage for that duration. Resist the Urge will change his alignment to Lawful Good, and he will deal more damage for each good champion in the formation, stacking multiplicatively. This will unlock the Wither's Resurrection ultimate ability, which will summon Withers to appear in the back of your formation, dealing 1 hit of ultimate damage and pushing enemies back to their side of the screen. Any champion that has been knocked out / killed will be revived to full health and will be immune to damage for 15 seconds. If it can, this ability will automatically trigger if Dirge is knocked out. This can be a very useful passive tool to keep your formation up and running in dire situations. And keep in mind, for Dirge's ult, you can earn a feat through his variants that will make familiars not activate his ultimate, so you can keep that revive ready for when you really need it. His equipment is top-notch. First, flat scaling his own damage. The second, scaling his perma-stacking additive bonus, the Urge. The next two, how he scales the pre-stack bonuses for both Ceramorphosis and Living on the Edge. One to scale the damage bonus gained from his second set of specialization choices in evil or good champions. And lastly, ultimate cooldown. Being able to scale 2 pre-stack damage buffs makes his scaling quite good. His feats, on the other hand, are pretty average, about what you'd expect, nothing crazy. But you're going to want to be sticking to scaling Ceramorphosis and Living on the Edge more than likely anyway. Normally this is where I talk about the currently running event, but we've talked enough about that, so let's dive right into his achievement and variants. His achievement is very simple, only requiring you to gain 1,000 murder stacks while he is affected by 6 stacks of Living on the Edge. Just kill enemies while he's fully stacked up. Though this does bring up a funny thought, what if you reach the cap of 4 billion and he has never been 6 out of 6 for Living on the Edge? Does that lock out his achievement? Anyway, all of his variants have him forced in your formation, able to be moved but not removed. His first variant should remain easy throughout the tiers, in regard to how far you can personally push, of course, as the only real restraint here is that only DPS champions can deal damage, and you have to use him. Though clicks can also still deal damage, not too bad. The second only allows the use of those with either the DPS role or members of the Absolute Adversaries and the Heroes of Baldur's Gate affiliations. This is meant to represent his Living on the Edge, though why the hell they don't just include Absolute Adversaries to count for that as well? This one will for sure be a touch more difficult if you haven't unlocked or invested in the Absolute Adversaries or Heroes of Baldur's Gate, or if you don't have multiple DPS group buffing champions. The third will restrict you to only being able to use good and evil champions to represent his specialization choice, though you do also get access to the Absolute Adversaries. Each wave will also spawn an Armored Mind Flayer that does not drop gold or count toward quest progress. This is about on par with the previous in my opinion, only locking you out of neutral champions. While it was much easier to just run the 3 flat variants before, don't be discouraged if you can't push high up in the tiers yet. This game is all about time invested, and unless you can otherwise clear up to the potential area requirement, don't strain yourself too hard in trying to push up the tiers. Really just focus on how far you can push on average, and how these restrictions will affect that. Obviously, his availability is unrivaled, well, other than Dungeon Master, being available for literally everything no matter what. While this is much like Dungeon Master, I find it almost more important than DM, because even though DM can bring someone else in, If you invest in Dirge as your main damage-dealing champion, that means you will always, no matter what, have access to your invested DPS. That is huge, at least in my opinion. Now, a lot of the restrictions will hurt his kit though, as he very much relies on Ceramorphosis to really pop off. But still, one of the bigger problems with him is that pesky will. Dirge wants the Ceramorphosis he offers, and Folk Hero can become an amazing buff. But being a Dragonborn sorcerer makes things incredibly difficult to set up a proper Folk Hero, and is at this time impossible to have 10 stacks of Ceramorphosis while having 3 stacks of Folk Hero. There are a few ways you can go about it with the seats we have available to work with. Let's assume you're using the Absolute Adversaries alongside Nrak and Dynahair with their Ceramorphosis feats. That will give you 8 stacks of Ceramorphosis. These champions are a good standard to work with as far as raw buffing power. Minsk will push it to too many humans and doesn't offer great buffing. Viconia will bump clerics up too high and also doesn't offer the greatest buffing. Imoen is out of the question as she oddly shares a seat with Dirge and is also a human anyway. So we're looking for a Dragonborn and a Sorcerer for Folk Hero. We have 2 primary options here. We can pair Valentine for the Sorcerer with either Orkira or Egbert to cover Dragonborn. Orkira offers better buffing, but Egbert gets you another tank and some decent knockbacks. Another option is to instead use Nixie as the Sorcerer with Egbert. Valentine is the more ideal to work with, as if you need to, you can use her for the difficult positioning and rely on her duplicating positionals to Dirge, so he can be put somewhere where he is only adjacent to DPS. And should the last remaining Origin of Baldur's Gate 3 show up offering his delicious looking hand, that means another human. Meaning we'll either need to replace Dynahair in the formation, or hope Dirge gets something to work with. Like, if nothing else, a glitch feat to make him count as human. He's the DPS of the formation, for the love of God. How does he not synergize with his team? I really feel like Dirge's class should have been completely tied to his feats, so you could mix and match classes together, and then he'd be like the nerds, and be able to qualify for all 4 just through classes, and not have to worry about races. Dirge was designed to not have its identity tied to class to begin with. Oh well. Or at the end of the day, say screw Will's Folk Hero and just focus on having 10 Ceramorphosis stacks, as Dirge's scaling is incredibly important on his own if he's going to be your DPS, and sacrificing 8 out of 10 Ceramorphosis for 3 out of 4 Folk Hero instead of pre-stack scaling off of 10 out of 10 Ceramorphosis and 1 out of 4 Folk Hero is potentially questionable depending on item levels. That's not all that's rough with his formation either. As for Shadowheart, you'll want him adjacent to whoever she is duplicating, and that's likely going to be Astarion, who isn't a DPS. So you're going to have him adjacent to a non-DPS all the time, which hurts his living on the edge scaling. The only way to negate this is to have someone who is a formation buffing DPS with higher dexterity or equal dexterity in a higher seat. So ideally Zorbu, Catti-brie, or Birdsong, which none have a Ceramorphosis stack. No matter which way you go with it, you're losing some form of scaling here. Really, I reiterate again, living on the edge should have counted DPS champions and absolute adversaries. This entire lack of cohesion with his own affiliation is baffling to me. And these champions together in general might make for some rough restrictive positioning moments with tanks in particular. But you'll have Karlach's HP sharing and Dynahair's overwhelm increase at least to make someone an off-tank who normally wouldn't be. And with Dirge's ultimates, he's able to stay in the fray longer than others in case he needs to be in the front lines. Anyway, at the end of the day, the Dark Urge is really good. He's a DPS with actually good scaling, and the best availability in the game alongside Dungeon Master. This might be a bit biased as I'm an availability slut, and I really want to make him S tier, as he's probably the boy that I'm going to invest in over Artemis now. The only reason I'm not putting him in S is his affiliation, formation, and abilities are so counterintuitive and working against themselves. So he's going to gatekeep the tippity top of the A tier until that gets ironed out. But we're not done yet. Now I have to cover the reworked champion, Dhadius. The human wizard in Seed 5. When it comes to a reworked champion, I tend to only cover the changes instead of their kit as a whole, as I have at some point covered every champion in the past. If you are unfamiliar with him and curious how he used to work, check out the original video he was a part of, which will be linked in the description, I think. Honestly, he very much largely works the same, just better. To begin with, his skill empowerment still increases the damage of champions with a 14 or higher intelligence within 2 slots. However, it now scales for each champion affected by the ability, stacking multiplicatively. While this may sound similar in a way to the recent Dynahair, he does not have any way to scale the pre-stack, unfortunately. His practice makes perfect now debuffs enemies based on the orb's type between its random cycle of acid, frost, and fire. Each debuff will increase the damage of subsequent orbs of that damage type, stacking multiplicatively up to 5 times. This buff was a bit clunky before, and as these debuffs will not expire, it's much easier to stack and maintain now. He also gains a new formation ability that scales skill empowerment with Chromatic Wonder, where he keeps track of the total number of sets of all 3 orb types he casts in the current area. He will increase the effect of skill empowerment for each set, stacking multiplicatively and capping at a total of 20 stacks. He now also has 2 sets of specialization choices. The first is simply a choice between scaling up skill empowerment for each champion with a magical-based attack, or those without a magical-based attack. Simply choose whichever is higher in your formation. The second is where his 2 original choices will be found, either double downing as a DPS with empowered orbs, or a support with empowered empowerment. But now he also has a third choice, use smaller words, where he will reduce the required intelligence of skill empowerment to 12 and higher. This really does help people qualify, and that is all the more important now as it scales with how many people it is actively up on. His availability isn't the greatest, being available only for Strahd naturally and Zariel with Feats, and is in a seat that is highly competitive. But, what isn't these days? His numbers have been brought up to contend with the current standard. He's gone from mid to good, but not the best. He's rising through the ranks from C to high B. Thanks for coming around and getting your updates to the game here with me. I know this was a lot to take in, and in my haste to compact all of this info into one digestible piece of content, I've probably forgotten something along the way. So hit up the comments with your thoughts on events, Dirge, Daddy Yass, or anything I missed. Slap that like, sub, and bell for me. And as always, the most important thing of all, have a hell of a time out there, champion.